A very good morning, and let me welcome you to the business session 2, Commerce and Connectivity in the ORF Kolkata and the Consulate General of Japan in Kolkata hosted conference, Strategic High Tide in the Indo-Pacific, Economics, Ecology and Security. There is no doubt that the Indo-Pacific space is quite complex, essentially a boiler of theatrical forces that keep on affecting each other through an interactive dynamics between geopolitics and geostrategy, as also geoeconomics and the environmental and the climatic drivers. Now, this has been brought out quite clearly in the inaugural session yesterday, and we also had an excellent session on the geopolitics and the security aspects as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, and the cross-cutting issues eventually emerged out there as well. On the other hand, the debate on an emerging new global economic order had been floating ever since China announced its Belt and Road Initiative more than 7 years ago. Now, with BRI being a global development strategy involving infrastructure development and investments in nearly 70 countries to exploit the cheap factor markets and expanding product markets, this was thought to be rocking the status quo of the Occident ruling the roost. The idea of the status quo in the global political and economic order was, however, challenged further with the emergence of strong leaders prior to the pandemic and the dominance of nationalistic fervors, emerging more from xenophobic discernment of some of the major nations, as also the insulating tendencies of economies that were once major proponents of free market economies and globalization. And we noted such insulating tendencies, in fact, with the US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the prolonged US-China trade war, at one point in time, the Trumpian disregard of the climate change crisis and the Brexit. On the other hand, China's BRI again started obtaining momentum with nations from the European Union, Asia, and Latin America joining in. Now, this marked the happy ride of China on its BRI horse, which was attempted to be combated by some of the coalitions like the Quad in the Indo-Pacific potential security arrangement among the 4 large democracies, namely Australia, India, Japan, and the US. However, the pandemic again turned out to be a driver which changed the course of the game to a large extent. Now, India's withdrawal from the RCEP has also been classified under the same category. Of course, there are some other bigger concerns which need greater deliberations. Now, despite the insulating tendencies that we often know, as also the fact that there have been recent border skirmishes between China and India and other forms of misgivings in the geopolitical fora, China-India trade is supposed to exceed US $100 billion in 2021, marking a massive jump from the pre-pandemic levels. Does this mean that geopolitical concerns and the economic concerns are largely decoupled despite the nationalistic calls? Now, the Indo-Pacific presents itself as a massive market from both perspectives, the product market and the factor market, comprising of 38 countries with 65% of the world's population, 62% of the world's GDP, 46% of the world's merchandise trade. The issues of connectivity and regional development, of course, loom large. Now, how do we actually discern and understand the scope of such a market? How do we optimally use such a market? How do we exploit the GVCs that exist in this particular space? How do we understand and exploit the forward and the backward linkages associated with the value chain? What types of trade and connectivity arrangements should emerge? Again, geostrategic and geopolitical concerns, can they be allowed to weigh on such geoeconomic and developmental concerns? Now, this remains a normative question. Further, as I just stated, that there are national economic goals that may come in the ways of achieving broader regional goals, protecting domestic industry, generating local employment, alleviating poverty. These are also some of the crucial goals of the global south in the region in this particular space, while the richer nations in the space have different goals altogether. Now, this divergence of goals has often come in the ways of creating regional trade agreements or free trade areas, as their impacts are different across nations and also vary across a value chain, either a commodity value chain or a service value chain within a nation. So the more fundamental question that remains is, that we, of course, the trade economists, often go by the assumption of monotonicity of well-being function with respect to trade. That means more trade is better. So is unbridled trade always good? Well, these are the few questions that we pose, in fact, as far as this session is concerned. And we do have a galaxy of star speakers in this session. Rohan Samarajiva, the founder of LIR NE Asia Sri Lanka, Takuma Otaki, advisor to the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Government of Japan, and Policy Director of JETRO, New Delhi. We are missing out on Famida Khatun, who had to drop out because of an exigency that had suddenly prevailed. We have Akshay Mathur, who is the director of Observer Research Foundation in Mumbai, as also the head of geoeconomic studies at the Observer Research Foundation. Professor Arpita Mukherjee, who is the professor at the ICRIAR, International Council for Research on Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi, and Professor Shaun Rai, who is also a professor at ICRIAR, New Delhi. So let me begin with the deliberation from Rohan Samarajiva. And before I go to Mr. Samarajiva, let me just remind the speakers that if you confine your deliberation to 10 minutes, then we can have adequate time for interactions with the audience as also in between the speakers. So over to you, Mr. Samarajiva.
Good morning. Happy to have this opportunity to talk about digital connectivity, in particular with regard to the Indo-Pacific. I'll be talking in terms of layers. So of course, before we get to that, we'll have to start with the statement that was made by the moderator: more trade is better. Now, our own research at Learn Asia, which is a ICT policy and regulatory think tank, a regional think tank, what we did was something called a systematic review, where we reviewed thousands of research articles very rigorously using protocols and systematic methods. And this article was published. It basically shows that the existence of telecommunications or mobile networks, the very existence, not the layering of various applications and services on top of it, but the very existence improves economic outcomes for the people living in those rural areas. So if I extrapolate from that, I would say that Timor-Leste would be, the economic benefits to the people of Timor-Leste would be improved, would be enhanced if they were to be connected to through digital means. I use this particular country as an example, one of the Asia-Pacific countries that does not have a undersea cable of its own that lands in its territory. They have to go through Indonesia, and they get what I call Indonesia plus prices. So let's begin from that level of cables. If you look at the Atlantic, you look at the Pacific, these are extraordinarily widely, broadly cabled areas. Europe itself is extraordinarily rich in cables, both undersea as well as terrestrial. The difference in the Indo-Pacific, if you look at the eastern part around Japan, there's enough undersea cables. But by the time you get to the Bay of Bengal, it gets quite thin. So, for example, Bangladesh is currently connected to two cables, two consortium cables. But just 10 years ago, it was connected to, just 5 years ago, it was connected to only one. And if that went down, they had enormous problems in connectivity. And in 2005, they were connected to none. And this was a more or less similar story for Myanmar as well. So we have a problem with inadequate connectivity in these areas, particularly with regard to resilience and robustness of networks. But the key problem that was identified was that we don't have the terrestrial cables that are found in Europe and in North America in particular. We tend to be sort of behaving more like peninsulas rather than as a continent. If we have the terrestrial cables, we could have a mesh network where if a failure in one area, for whatever reason, earthquakes, whatever, would be immediately compensated by the routing of the traffic over another part of the mesh network. So since 2010, my organization has been working with the UN ESCAP, the Economic and Social Commission for the Asia-Pacific, which has prioritized this issue. And the particular formulation is in a program called Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway, where sort of the ideal case is that we will have the Asian Highway and the Asian Trans-Asian Railway Network. We will have fiber optic cables running along them, connecting all the major population centers, commercial centers. And this would also be complementing the growing undersea cable connectivity. And Asia would then begin to get digital connectivity, that layer that you find in Europe and in North America. We would also begin. And given the increasing nature of importance of Asia as a market, as well as export, as countries that export, I think this is going to be extremely important. Now, on top of this connectivity, you must have, our research showed that simply connectivity isn't enough. If you don't have physical transportation linkages, and if you have removed the barriers to trade and interaction between these hitherto isolated markets, you wouldn't realize all the benefits. So you get systems like ASICUDA, which, for example, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on have joined, which is a customs information database that is supported by UNCTAD. And these kinds of systems will help the logistics management and the movement of goods and goods in particular. Now, when it comes to services, we realize that the customs choke points don't exist, and trade in services, particularly when it occurs over these digitally connected networks, can take place almost ubiquitously. Now, if we take conventional trade and the supporting infrastructure that's needed for that, before a ship comes in or an aircraft lands, you have enormous amounts of documentation being pre-processed, coming in and being pre-processed and stored and analyzed, and approvals being given and so on, so that the turnaround and the efficiency of the transportation systems are enhanced. Now, with regard to, you can do that technically, you can do that without connecting the entire hinterland through digital connectivity. But by the time you get to digital trading, as the APEC grouping likes to call it, or the old-fashioned word is e-commerce, B2C, business to customer e-commerce occurring through platforms such as Alibaba or Amazon and so on. Now you get a qualitatively different complexion to the benefits that you get from this digital connectivity, including from the lowering of transaction costs that would allow even smaller players who would not be able to navigate the conventional trading systems to participate. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer that. I'll conclude at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Samarajiva, on bringing about a very important aspect of how essentially the digital connectivity can enhance the efficiency of the entire trading system. We will come back with questions, I presume, at the end of the session. With that, let me turn to Mr. Otaki. Mr. Otaki, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Am I audible now? Am I,
You are,
am I,
you are, you are.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on this precious meeting. I'm Takuma Otaki. I have worked for energy policy sector for 10 years in Japan, and now I am charged with promoting India-Japan economic tie. And I am working in Delhi, and nowadays I mainly focus on supply chain resilience and green technologies. And I quickly start to talk about today's topic by following the question from your coordinators. And first question was that what have been the key learning from the pandemic in terms of sustaining seamless commerce and connectivity in times of global crisis? And my answer is that obviously digitalization is the key factor, and I will tell details about this later. And next question was that can enhanced economic cooperation contribute towards economic revival for the region? And my answer is that, in my opinion, yes. COVID-19 led to the fact that even Japanese people who have face-to-face meetings are no longer afraid to discuss things online. In the case of Japan, we can now have discussion with India that we used to have with ASEAN because of the distance. Theoretically, we are now in a world where we can connect point to point where the potential is the highest for both sides. It means that we potentially have much efficient enhanced economic cooperation before pandemic. Thus, I would like to pursue the way for strengthening our relationship with other countries, especially now at this time, India. And next question is that what are the primary impediments hindering trade in the region, and how can they be overcome? And is enhanced bilateral mutual codependency the answer, or more integrated multilateralism better? And for this question, for first part, again, theoretically, we can connect any economic entities all over the world, but we recognize that one of the biggest challenges is how to manage the overabundance of online webinars and other information at the cost and emotional hurdle of disseminate information online has become too low. Once we succeed to pick only useful information up from the bunch of information, we should be able to achieve more effective collaboration than before. For the second part, with the pandemic, each country was literally on the verge of national extinction, and there were many scenes where the nationalistic stance had to be emphasized. And I believe that the stance of refraining from cooperation with other countries in the future and overemphasizing of independence will delay the development of the world and undermine many opportunities for development. I think it is necessary to learn from the experience of the recent crisis and discuss how to build a relationship that can be valid in times of emergency. Therefore, I think countries that can be connected, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, should have discussion to strengthen cooperation. In addition, I personally believe that in order to make the lives of people around the world richer and more stable, it is further essential to build up strong, mutually beneficial, sustainable relationship among private companies across borders, rather than heavily relying on political ties supported by unstable democracies. And next question, to what extent can digital connectivity boost connectivity and commerce in the region? Again, the same answer. In theory, the world has become virtually connected, and it has become more difficult to select useful information. So I believe that it is important for each entity to accurately grasp the characteristics and relative strengths of the region and to be able to properly disseminate this information, which will result in stronger connections in the region and stronger business ties. And last question was that what are the political economic drivers determining the future of trade in the region, and what will be the role of RCEP in this process? My answer is that preventing protectionism and regionalism will help promote healthy and effective trade. protectionism is a major impediment to gradual industrial development, and regionalism unnecessarily limits the number of business partners. Government intervention should not result in delaying the development of industry and the improvement of the quality of life. For this reason, I believe that public institutions should be based on the premise of cooperation with other countries and should not argue about how far they can go on their own. As for the RCEP, which India has withdrawn from, I don't think it is necessary for India to join the RCEP by force, but I think it is very important to continue discussion on how we can effectively cooperate with the region. As a member of the METI and government official of Japan, I would like to carefully discuss with each entity what kind of cooperation is possible, and rather than being bounded by the existing framework. So now we are METI continuing with this situation and things. We are now trying to discuss for strengthening our supply chain resilience with India and Australia and other ASEAN countries. And my answer is over. So thank you for listening. I will give my mic back to our coordinator. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Otaki. In fact, you have touched upon quite a few vital points, including that of the RCEP. And apart from talking about how essentially the digital space is bringing about more efficiency to the system, you also talked about information overload and the costs that are essentially associated with when we move from the physical space to the digital space. Of course, I have a few questions on that, which we can come on later. But since the RCEP topic has also been brought up here, I presume that some of the subsequent speakers are also going to take that up. So Akshay, it's over to you now to take over, especially from the geoeconomic aspects of things.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilanjan. I have 3 or 4 points I'd like to make. I think that it is clear from the objective of your conference as well as this session that we need to align foreign policy and foreign trade policy much better with our economic goals. What has happened with the Indo-Pacific, I think, is that it does not have the underlying undergirding of an economic framework that, say, NAFTA had when the United States, Canada, and Mexico came together, or say even with APEC had when the United States was trying to make inroads into Asia Pacific, which was limited to Southeast Asia. I recognize that since then there is RCEP, and that outside of India there are other countries that are part of RCEP. But then again, RCEP will be a smaller part of Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific extends all the way to the east coast of Africa. And so therefore there are many nations in the Gulf, West Asia, East Africa that of course are not part of RCEP. So an underlying economic framework is missing, which then puts the responsibility on individual nations, and then also specific large multinationals to then drive commerce and connectivity and supply chains across the region. And I think this is a very important conceptual development, including for India, because while the world may recognize and chastise us even for not being part of the different agreements, the Indian government has taken many steps in the recent past to develop our own industry, make certain national champions in certain specific industries, so that if we have more firms and we have larger multinationals, Indian multinationals, they can then insert themselves into the supply chains and the business that is taking place in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I do have 3 points that specifically I wanted to mention. I think that for India to be part of any new economic framework, I think we will have to persuade the Quad countries or the US particularly, but even Japan for that matter, and Australia to open up their supply chains and include India. And I think without being part of an American or Japanese-led supply chains, it will not be possible for India to play any kind of a significant or meaningful role in this region. A second part I wanted to mention is that I think it is probably important for India to now think of futuristic industries. It's no surprise that we are trying to go into focus on digitalization, but electronics and electrical machinery is one surprisingly is one sector where we have done well, even though we have a large dependence on China on electrical machinery. Over 60% of our imports come from China. But still, we have had over 20 to 25% compounded annual growth rate in the electronics exports. And so I think that is something that we can build upon. It will be difficult for us to insert ourselves into the supply chains that already exist. And of course, China is dominated here. And so much of the supply chains in the digital and the electronic space is dominated in between 4 or 5 countries, United States, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and China, that it's difficult for any nation, let alone India, to participate. In fact, I remember that McKinsey had done a study where they had looked at the supply chains of Dell and Lenovo, the American and the Chinese computer manufacturing companies. And they both had close to 4,000 to 5,000 tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. That means first set of suppliers and the suppliers that they reach out to. And that's 4,000 to 5,000 each, and out of which 2,000 of them were common to Dell and Lenovo. So that goes to show how much integration there is and how difficult it is to decouple supply chains, even though nations and geopolitics may force you to. And so I think it's a combination of things where India will have to do its bit to insert ourselves into the electronic supply chains. And the last point I want to make, the third and the last point on this thing, is that as we are talking about digitalizing and we are banking on our industries to grow and to insert ourselves into a economic framework that spreads across Indo-Pacific, and we're looking at the American multinationals and the Japanese multinationals, I think what is also happening, unfortunately, for India, is that just as we are preparing to globalize, the multinationals themselves are deglobalizing, in the sense that if you look at IT companies today, there's one IT company is able to do a lot more with one capital investment in one location than it used to. So for instance, it does not need to invest 5 times over in a country. It can use the same mega factory, or it can use the same physical location for services, and then be able to then leverage that for a variety of things, from research and engineering and innovation. So you don't need that kind of capital investment that we used to need. In fact, UNCTAD calls it the Transnationality Index, where the transnationality of multinationals has been reducing. It's plateaued off, which means that the revenue share of from foreign enterprises and their foreign sales based on total sales is actually plateaued off. And so while we are trying to globalize and we want to connect, the multinationals themselves are deglobalizing and consolidating. And of course, with everything going on in the world, all this uncertainty with the pandemic and sanctions and climate change, they're consolidating and ensuring there is more resilience. So I think from a geoeconomics perspective, there is certainly just to recap, there's certainly an economic framework that is still missing across the Indo-Pacific. And if we were to look at the multinationals that are coming and the supply chains that exist, we certainly in India have to do better to plug ourselves into that supply chain. But it's not going to be an easy task, because there are certain underlying trends with deglobalization that I think we will have to address. So I'll stop here, Nilanjan.
Thank you, Akshay. Some very critical, vital points came out, especially in the context of a missing economic framework as far as the Indo-Pacific configuration is concerned. And the deglobalizing or the insulating tendencies, I should say insulating tendencies, but definitely a deglobalizing tendencies on part of the multinationals. Well, I will of course come back to that with a question. Just keep it in mind that what are the reasons for it? Are they really looking for more stable destinations for keeping their investments, or is it that because of some other reasons that such a tendency is essentially emerging among the multinationals? So, Professor Mukherjee, in fact, I presume the stage is already set for you, given that others have already talked about RCEP and deglobalizing tendencies, as also the missing economic architecture as far as the Indo-Pacific configuration is concerned. So, of course, you can have your own presentation, your own views, but if you also can throw lights on what others have felt, I presume that the discussion is going to attain a separate, distinctly different level altogether. So over to you, Professor Mukherjee.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and thanks to ORF for inviting me to speak in this session. In fact, it is very interesting that I heard all of you, and I would actually pick it up from there. Yes, there is a issue. What COVID-19 has taught us is, you cannot, while you need to set up your supply chain, you cannot be all dependent on the supply chain because of this COVID-related lockdown and supply chain disruption. So at the same time, there is a phenomenon of supply chain risk and de-risking of supply chains, and everybody wants to be closer to their home and, move away from all egg in one basket kind of a mode. So definitely this is going to change, and 4IR technology that we see is here to stay. So it was already there, but COVID is probably fast-tracked this technology, and technology is now going to be a key component of any trade discussion. Now, if you put it in the Indo-Pacific context, what other speakers have said, I just want to clarify one more point is that, countries have given their individual Indo-Pacific strategies, and countries' interest has been highlighted in their Indo-Pacific strategies. For example, US interest in technology comes out very clear in its paper, but there is nothing called a common interest. Countries in that, only regions in that are today thinking about their common interest. Like ASEAN is trying to come out with a common strategy paper. So they are trying to work it out. So we haven't reached there. We are in a very early stage in terms of common interest. And the common interest is going to develop by country by, it's not around countries, it is around small regions, group of countries that it is going to develop. And that is where we need to look into how these develop and how these small developments can fit into the massive agenda. Because as Akshay rightly pointed out, it's not like a NAFTA that, or like the CTPP, where you have a commitment to do certain things. Now, then you come to the point of RCEP. RCEP would have played a major role here, and people may argue in favor or against India being in the RCEP. But the fact remains is that commitments of countries which are in RCEP is actually much lower than their bilateral commitments. So if you look at Australia-China problems post RCEP signing, you would see that even in sectors like wines, etc., where they have given a full commitment and tariff reduction, Australia is facing problem in China. So, a trade agreement is good, but it is not about the agreement signing. It is about the quality of the commitments that you take, and more countries in the region, also within the Indo-Pacific, are becoming very, very, protectionist at this stage, including leaders like the US. So, when there is a protectionism, there is always a fear that countries will find new means to, and that can, if you reduce tariff, they can come out with non-tariff barrier, other restrictions. So, there are always new means of protectionism, and I don't think that even RCEP or any trade agreements today are having enough framework to handle those. And that is something that we need to really look into beyond tariff, into the trade agreement, if we really want to have a sustainable global value chain. Now, if you look into cross-border issues, see, there are 4 or 5 core issues. One is that Indo-Pacific countries are very varied in terms of their infrastructure endowment and access, and abilities to fund the infrastructure. So there is always some larger players and there are all smaller players, and the ability to take the smaller player around through collaboration and cooperation is going to make technology work in this region. Like, technology can create a digital divide and it can worsen in a bigger framework unless we are careful about mitigating it. So that is one part of the story. Second part of the story is that, technology is evolving at a much faster rate than regulation can work on it. So that is creating a regulatory issue related to security, cyber fraud, and that is where there is need for more collaboration, understanding, and information sharing. Thirdly, when we talk about cross-border technologies or cables, we talk about mutual recognition of standards, practices. Fourth is about digital, learning, digital skill upgradation, the digital literacy. There, in these areas, digital skill, collaboration with smaller developing countries, these areas where the larger player, including countries like India, which has a very good technological strength, can play a key role. So at this stage where Indo-Pacific is, what we can push through is greater collaboration, both in terms of and capacity building initiatives, recognition of standards, startups movement, encourage growth of startups, cross-border collaboration of startups, and regulatory sharing and regulatory cooperation. If we focus on these areas, I think we can move to the next step. Thank you, Nilanjan.
Thank you. Thanks, Atal. I think, every deliberation is having newer points. Of course, this is something that came up even yesterday, that there is often a deficit of common interests among the various nations, and every nation in the Indo-Pacific somehow is coming up with their own versions when it comes to any form of collaboration, or even in the context of the blocks that they tend to create, whether it's in the form of in the form of security arrangements or in the form of the economic arrangements. The other issue that came up, of course, is the issue of digital divide and the regulatory issues, which you mentioned. Especially those are, I presume, going to be, as we move towards a more technology-enabled world, these are the critical costs that the society has to incur. And we are already incurring that, in fact, due to the pandemic, because I presume, as Mr. Otaki mentioned, that the entire domain, as far as Japan is concerned, it has moved largely to the digital world. As far as our services sector is concerned, those who are digitally enabled, well, they are going to prosper. But what about those who are not digitally enabled? Are they going to completely fade away from the face of the economy? That is also a critical concern. I don't know about what is going to happen to the kirana shops in and around us. So, well, these are, of course, the social inequity is going to be a negative externality or the fallout of movement to the digital world. That is bound to happen. And so we will come to this concern, in fact, later on during our discussions. Well, now I move to Professor Shaun Rai. Shaun, I presume that you have a presentation, a PPT, right? So you can go ahead, but there are some other concerns that have also come up, so you can also respond to those. You have time.
Thank you, Nilanjan. I will actually not be making the presentation because I've been told that there could be a technical problem, but I'll speak from the presentation. Firstly, thank you to ORF for giving me this opportunity to speak. Many things have been said by all the speakers before, so I will talk about what I know, which is supply chain resilience and GVCs. So one of the things that the pandemic has shown us is the interdependence and also the increase of protectionism as countries ran out of PPEs, right early in March 2020. The other thing that was very apparent that every country actually, in some sense, depends so much on other countries. And so this interdependence, whether we like it or not, is here to stay. And despite certain countries wanting to move away from, one source of supply, mainly China, it is not going to be easy to decouple, and nor will the way to decouple also will be. It has to be done strategically. I mean, so if you suddenly want to decouple from all your APIs, for example, in the context of India, overnight we cannot start producing all the APIs in the country. So having said that, what the COVID has also taught us is that what was expected at the beginning was that the decline in trade volumes would be quite significant, and the WTO has in fact predicted that it would go down significantly. It did not go down by that extent. In fact, based on the scenarios that the WTO had predicted, the worst case scenario was not the scenario that was borne out. The scenario that was borne out is that world trade did rebound, and it was partly because of the East Asian countries, and the East Asian countries led by China rebounded much faster than the other countries. So the interdependence, in fact, brings into play the question that is important for what we are discussing today: the primary impediments that hinder trade in the region, and how can bilateralism or multilateralism help the countries. So what has happened is this region is a very important region, and if you see it in one sense, this region marks the shift in gravity of the world economic center, in some sense, to the region. And if you purely from the maritime trade point of view, this region, the Indo-Pacific region, or the South China Sea, is actually where 60% of the maritime trade is happening. All the major countries, the US, India, as well as Japan, are using the sea routes in the region. Now, the region, of course, is, the speakers before have talked about the fact that there is no economic framework in the region. But there have been, partnerships in the region. The famous ones, of course, are the ASEAN, and the newer ones are the RCEP and all that. But I think there are a few other economic partnerships and they are coming about because of this understanding of the importance of diversifying and building more resilient supply chains. And I will talk about two initiatives that are very recent but seem to be promising. One is, of course, the Asean-Japan Joint Initiative for Economic Resilience, and it's stemmed from the COVID, but the idea is actually to smoothen the flow of goods and build more resilient supply chains. The second is the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which has countries like India, Japan, Australia, and the US. Mainly the Quad countries. And the objective here again is to diversify the supply chains and build much more resilient supply chains. So one of the lessons that was learned from the pandemic is that while you cannot put all your eggs in one basket, you need to diversify. How you would diversify, how can you build more resilient supply chains, is something that all the countries will be looking forward going ahead. And partnerships will be built actually based on that. And I think we will see much more action in the Indo-Pacific going ahead. So I will stop here as far as my first intervention, and I can come back if you have any more questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shayan. I presume, of course, there will be a host of questions on this. Let me again go back to Mr. Samarajiva. In fact, Mr. Samarajiva, I presume that you have made out that a host of interventions as far as the digital space is concerned came up during the deliberations. Now, it has also been talked of course, as far as efficiency is concerned, efficiency of the entire trading system is concerned, that has been enhanced quite a bit. But as far as this space is concerned, because Arpita Mukherjee talked about the digital divide. Now, digital divide is not only prevalent within a nation, but it is also something that is prevalent across nations. So how do we essentially do away with this inequity, or is this inequity going to come in the way of creating a lopsided trading architecture? What do you think about that? Mr. Samarajiva, are you there? I think there has been some kind of a technical glitch and he has dropped out. So yes, I presume the same question prevails for Mr. Otaki. Mr. Otaki, would you like to respond to this question? Well, Mr. Samarajiva, I just asked a question whether you have heard about it or not. The question is that you talked about Mr. Samarajiva, are you there? Okay, let me go to Mr. Otaki. Mr. Otaki, would you like to respond to this question?
This is a little bit difficult, so can I have time? So could you go next?
Okay, fine. Let me go to, because I have a separate question for Akshay. Let me go to Arpita Mukherjee. Professor Mukherjee.
So basically, see, this is a very interesting question. Like at a multi-country level, which is of different, developing, and different levels of digitalization, we can look into this as something which is happening in G20. Like we can look into some digital inclusion and digital financial inclusions for vulnerable groups like SMEs, women, and so on and so forth, even as a part of the Indo-Pacific agenda, to make it much more, to reduce the digital divide and focus more on digital literacy and other programs across countries. Because if we don't do that, there will be always some countries who will have a fear of integration. Now, in this context, let me help Takuma with the next question. Is that some countries have good experiences, good data, which can be used for analysis, provided there is cross-country data collaboration. And that is what Japan has been talking to India about, sharing of data with a trust. India wants to talk about this as a safe harbor clause in its agreement with the European Union. So there is a bit of a, now when you talk about data, digital inclusions across countries or digitalization for social goods, you then have to talk about coming out with an AI strategy for social good, sharing of data with a trust, and that is the next step forward in the Indo-Pacific framework.
Okay, so Mr. Samarajiva, the question that we are discussing right now was initially meant for you, that you talked about the efficiency that is being enhanced because of the digital space as far as trading efficiency is concerned. Now, Arpita Mukherjee raised this concern related to digital divide. Now, digital divide, it doesn't merely exist within a nation, but also exists across nations. So suppose, say, is that going to be a factor which is going to create a lopsided trading architecture, or in fact coming in the way of developing a new economic order as far as this space is concerned? So can we have your opinions? I will also come to Akshay and Shaunrai with this same question.
Yeah, it's somewhat ironic that as the digital question is being asked, I experience connectivity problems. But anyway, I'm back. The bottom line when we're talking about commerce is that we really need to think about the fact that money has to be made. People must trade. That is, they must trade goods or they must trade services. Now, a lot of money these days is being made by things that don't look like trade. So, for example, a lot of B2C or business to consumer trade, even in consumer items, is backed up by algorithms and by customer information, an analysis of customer information, and the value that is added to that process, to the marketing, to the value that the customers get, the competitive advantage that particular firms have and others do not have, and so on, is based on the collection of data, which doesn't look like trade, but in fact is a sort of a foundational aspect of trade. In my original comments, I simply talked about the connectivity, the hard connectivity and the availability of services for the two kinds of trade, using examples of trade in goods, where you'd have customs facilitation, logistics management, and so on, and trade in services where you'd have people buying and selling services directly. I provide a service, I get paid. Now, what also is happening is that there is underneath this the massive collection of data, and this whole idea that countries can or governments can cooperate in data is a bit of a red herring. Governments do sit on a lot of data, but they're not transaction data and they're not properly datafied, and governments don't use it even for their own purposes. Perhaps the spy agencies and the surveillance operations do that, but this is not the kind of data that they can share. So what is happening is that companies, the private sector, is collecting data. And the advanced companies that are at advanced stages of digitalization are using it internally. And in some instances, they are buying and selling the data or the insights based on the data. So this is where issues of AI and algorithms and all these things come in. So that is going to happen more or less outside the control of the governments. The governments may be able to use restrictive data protection laws, etc., but even these laws will apply to within their countries. So my favorite example of people who try to apply strict data localization rules is, what do you do with these airline frequent flyer miles that we no longer use? If we were to travel, we'd be racking up the miles. I will probably be having this conversation in Kolkata, and I would have racked up a certain number of miles that I would have then converted into another airline ticket or something like that at a certain point. Now, if governments think that they can both control this data, which is being analyzed and mined and productized in various ways, and if the governments think that that can be done by governments, I think they're completely, they're misleading themselves. These are inherently global platforms, and they are primarily in the private sector. The question that governments can do is they can get in the way, but that's about it.
Okay, thank you for
respond to your question.
Yeah, largely. So, Akshay, my question to you, of course, you can also have a response to this particular question, but I have a very specific question for you, especially on the 2 points that you mentioned. One is the deglobalizing tendency of the multinationals, as also the missing economic framework as far as the Indo-Pacific space is concerned. Now, let me come to the Indo-Pacific space. Now, this is a huge space, and you have extremely divergent, rather national goals or suppose regional goals, because even within the Indo-Pacific, you have various regions as such. And not only that, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity as far as regional aspirations when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. Do you really feel that there can be a common economic architecture, a common economic framework that can at all emerge in such a huge space, which is, suppose, say, having around, comprising of 38 nations with 65% of the world's population and 62% of the world's GDP? So that is my first question. And second is, of course, why essentially that the multinationals are deglobalizing? Why this tendency? Is it are they really looking for some safer havens for their investments, or they don't want to get into further diversification, get into some other zones beyond what they perceive as safe?
Nilanjan, on the first question, no, it's not possible to have one trade agreement across this entire region. Having said that, there are examples where countries have come together for new age regulations. We in India and in developing countries have painful experiences with negotiating trade agreements because of tariffs and because of all the direct implications it has on so many livelihoods. But also, if you take a look at, for instance, like the international tax deal that was just signed at the G20, you would not have thought that 136 countries would have come together to agree and accept that kind of a deal. So what does that show us? Maybe perhaps that that some of the issues on the trade agreements and the negotiating processes and the institutions like the WTO, but even other institutions, the national institutions and the ministries have not kept pace in creating new age frameworks. Probably the other takeaway is that perhaps sector specific or issue specific global agreements are more in demand and probably more appropriate. I mean, if I had mentioned that there's going to be an international tax deal, say even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I would be laughed out of the room, because tax is the most domestic. In fact, forget national; it's the most localized issue, where state governments and local city governments, and I mean, it's so complicated to have a global agreement across 136 countries would be laughable. But we did it. And obviously there was a reason to do it. Its applicability and it's how it gets executed, it is, of course, we'll have to wait and watch. So perhaps issue-specific or sector-specific agreements are going to be more in demand. On the idea of why the transnational companies are, if not deglobalizing, at least plateauing. One was the hint that I gave in the first intervention, which is that the ability for technology companies specifically to do a lot more with existing capital investment has grown. Gigafactories, robotics, you need to only do R&D in one location and you are able to share it with multiple factories around the world. All of that means that you don't have to replicate that age-old model of manufacturing when the Southeast Asian economies and China, etc., came up, where you needed 5 factories, each with their own R&D division, quality assurance, each with their own software and programs and supply chain and software that had to be installed locally. So that's the reason why you're able to leverage a lot more from the same capital investment. A second one is that while we talk about resiliency and China plus one, etc., there are very few industries where you actually can diversify your industry. I mean, for instance, if you take mining and agriculture, you cannot diversify or have a China plus one strategy. Mining is where it is. I mean, if the minerals are in Australia or they're in Congo, you can't expect that to have a Congo plus one strategy or an Australia plus one strategy. You have to remain there, which is why the companies have not diversified. If you look at high-tech sectors, very, very high-tech sectors, that's also immovable, contrary to what we think, because the kind of technology, investments, talent that say Taiwan and Japan and South Korea have in this region is very, very important to make sure those battery supply chains, etc., LED supply chains are all intact, and they've not been able to develop a plus one strategy. In fact, India itself, we ourselves have benefited because of the talent we have in one place in Bangalore or in Hyderabad, that very few countries have been able to take away our outsourcing competence, which we have benefited from for many years. So I think that this idea where companies are not globalizing is because there's very few industries that can actually do it. Now, let's take an example of which can. So, for instance, perhaps those that are slightly low tech can actually diversify away. So that's one area. The other area is maybe textiles or something, where Bangladesh currently has the expertise. Even India has some. Maybe that can be shared. So that leaves very, very few industries that can actually create a plus one strategy. And so I think that it is. I think we'll have to see. We have to disaggregate the industries and the firms to really see which are the ones that can really globalize. And then of course there is an international environment where there's some consolidation. There's a risk of opening up too many branches and not being able to control it. So I think those are the 3 reasons. And To Rohan's point about trade and services, I think this. What has happened in India, at least, is that the trade and services is something that has grown exponentially. And but it is mainly when we talk about trade and services here, we talk mainly about IT services. But trade and services actually includes education, healthcare, retail, logistics, supply chain, transport. We forget the 14 other. I mean, officially, I think the WTO classifies trade and services, I think, in 12 categories, and we talk in India only about one, which is the IT. So when you start looking at the other sectors, how tradable is education? How tradable is healthcare? To some extent, healthcare is becoming a little bit more. How tradable is logistics? And by the way, retail also comes under your Nike and Reebok showrooms also come under trade and services, Mode 3. So I think that we need a more sophisticated understanding of trade and services. I take Mr. Rohan's point. I endorse it. That certainly many of those are unregulated. And there is only one or two repositories that actually have trade and services data. So, for instance, central bank has the trade and services data, not the ports, not the customs, which typically used to have it. And so we have to work with the central bank to know what the trade and services data looks like, because they're the ones that are lodging and they get the data because of the payments and the receipts that are sent outside. So the other one is, I don't know, Mrs. Rohan knows about this or not, but like for India, the goods and services tax, it has an underlying database called the Goods and Services Tax Network, GSTN. Now, GSTN is that database through which a lot more information can be extrapolated because the tax filings have indicators on where companies are, which kind of services companies are paying for. But that is not out in the public domain. There'll be a lot of conversations about how to leverage GSTN. So I'll stop here. I think you should, I see Arpita smiling, so I think you should ask her a question about GSTN because they've done some work on it.
Oh, yes. We'll come to that. But there are two questions from the audience. One is a question for Akshay. The other is, I presume, for the panel. So let me first go to the question for Akshay. This is directed towards you, Akshay. This is for Akshay Mathur from Devasmita. How does the global tax agreement alter the scope for India to integrate itself into the global supply chains, particularly in the technology domain? Should I repeat?
I just missed a few words there. How does it help India into integrating into the global supply chains?
Right. Especially in the technology domain.
Yeah. So look, first, just a conceptual understanding of the international tax agreement is this, that there are two parts to it. The first part is about how do we actually ensure that digital multinationals are paying taxes not just where they're housed, but where they're generating the revenues. And second part is the global minimum tax of 15%. Now, when India has adopted it, India did it with the incentive that we wanted to be part of a global agreement, and that we should be positively contributing to something that has been discussed at G20. How much of it will really impact India is we have to see, because the brackets that have been used, the actual formula where, for the first part, only those companies above 750 million euros in revenue are going to be considered. In the second part, it is about those companies that are above $20 billion euros, but they have an operating margin, they have a profit margin of 10% or higher, out of which also certain specific taxation will come. By the time you're done filtering out, I think it leaves out very few multinationals in the bucket that will actually pay taxes here. But having said that, it is India's. It is done because India wanted to be part of a global agreement to systematize it, to have common standardized cross-border tax agreements, and it is not. I think I was not part of it, but I think the Indian government recognize that we don't want to be left out of this deal because we are part of. We want to attract those digital multinationals, those electronics multinationals, the Googles and the FANGs and everybody else. So I think that if we just wanted to be part of a standardized infrastructure, and I think if Google will, if you look at it from the perspective of Google or a Facebook or any other India is just any other country, just as United States, or just as Barbados, or just as Japan, or just as Jamaica. So it puts us on a level playing field, and that itself is an important start for India to attract the multinationals.
Thank you, Akshay. So I'll now come to Shaun. Shaun, in fact, of course, this question actually pertains to the entire panel, but I'll start with you. There are two questions here. One is from Shomo Bhaumik. This is the question reads: in the post-pandemic world, what scope does the altering focus of BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, present for trade and commerce in the Indo-Pacific region? I'm reading out yet again. In the post-pandemic world, what scope does the altering focus of the Belt and Road Initiative present for trade and commerce in the Indo-Pacific region? That is the first question. The second question is related to the RCEP. It has often been hypothesized that that RCEP would have presented an opportunity for the Indian industries or Indian SMEs to integrate with the ASEAN value chain. Is that true, or it would have been counterproductive? So there are two sets of questions for the panel. The first is on the BRI, the second is on the RCEP. So Shaun, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Nilanjan. I'll in fact take the RCEP question first. Now, whether RCEP would have given an opportunity to the SMEs to participate in global value chains, I mean, it is obviously now a counterfactual question because India withdrew out of RCEP. But it certainly would have, you see, the reason why countries sign agreements, there are 2-3 reasons. One is, of course, market access reasons, and which is why the tariff deals, the rationalization, etc. happens. To that extent, RCEP would have given that opportunity to the Indian SMEs to participate in the global regional value chains. But having said that, the reasons why India, in fact, did not sign are also very important, and they have to be taken into cognizance. One of the main reasons is that India thought that this deal was not, the agreement was not giving India the kind of level playing field that India wanted in terms of market access. That is both in terms of the tariff as well as the non-tariff barriers, and also the kind of agreement. I mean, India's past experience from other agreements, particularly the ASEAN agreement, has not given India the kind of market access that it had, that it could have. So, hypothetically, the access to the SMEs could have happened had India signed the RCEP. But given India's past experience, this is not written that it would happen. The reasons why, why India. One of the reasons why India should have participated is, of course, being part of, like Akshay said, in the context of the tax deal, is that if you are in the deal, then you are getting access to certain kinds of multipliers, which if you are not part of a deal, those do not work. And but having said that, I mean, since India has opted to stay out of it, it doesn't mean that India is not looking at signing other deals. India is, in fact, in the process of negotiating, it has restarted the negotiations with Australia. It is talking with the UK, and it is talking with other countries as well. So there are other ways in which, in fact, India can become part of Factory Asia, which is what India's objective would be, as well as Indian SMEs' objectives should be in integrating with Factory Asia. I will ask the BRI question because I have no knowledge on that. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Come to Arpita Mukherjee.
See, BRI has always been very sensitive for India politically. Economically, if an Indian private sector goes and invests in BRI, what can we do? It is also a geopolitical strategy of China. So, and it is about getting control of resources, infrastructure, and other requirements. So, BRI has always been something which is like a unknown animal to the Indian research team, because it is always shot down from a geopolitical angle. We have never really looked at it from an economic angle. Focusing on the RCEP question, when you sign a trade agreement, howsoever good your country is, there will be some gainers and losers, and you have to balance out. Everybody cannot gain out of the trade agreement, and we need to think how to balance out. And that is probably the biggest issue sometimes in India's negotiating trade agreement. Second is the tariff policy. See, we don't have the highest tariff in many cases, but we have a tariff across many items, and that is something we need to really think about. How do we look into that? And we have a lot of inverted duty, and when you do trade agreements of the scale with either US, European Union, RCEP, you need to think about how do you actually handle the inverted duty part before you sit for the negotiation. Third, we entered RCEP because of China. Everybody else wanted us inside RCEP, including our friends Japan, because of China, to counterbalance China. But China already had a better bilateral trade agreement with most of the RCEP member countries than us, and that's what we actually forgot. And we thought our RCEP would have been, and in my interaction for the last 10 years, I had always thought that RCEP I was always given that impression, like, let's study the trade in goods chapter, let's study the trade in services chapter, and we are done. And when we actually come to the negotiating table with, where there are 8-9 chapters, and we have just done a preliminary homework or 1 or 2 of them, it becomes very tough for the negotiators to move forward. And that's my very frank discussion with the Commerce Ministry, and that has been a problem now with the European Union and the US also. And Akshay brought it up, and I just want to conclude by saying that, see, we used to have trade in services and trade in goods, but because we didn't have products, software, we have only software services, not products, we fitted well into the negotiations, and we talked mode 4. Now that we have 4-tier technology, startups with product, it is a technology negotiation. It is neither a trade in services nor trade in goods, and we don't know where to fit in the technology. Other countries are going in for mode-wise commitments. They have left the GATS framework. They are going into UNCPC version 2 framework. We need to do those mapping. We need to do the classification of new technologies. We need to see what clauses can we put in, because we also are trying new things for the first time, and we need to be more prepared. I think when we are more prepared, we will also be able to gain from the trade agreements. And as researchers also, I think at points when we did RCEP, we were underprepared, and hopefully if we become more prepared with the new technology, we will gain from the trade agreements. Nilanjan.
Mr. Otaki, you were the first person who brought about this RCEP issue, in fact, during this discussion. And you said that India shouldn't be there by way of force, but should find different other ways to cooperate. And at the same time, you talked about that protectionism should be prevented. So what do you think about this mode? That is one question. But there is the other question that is already there is, what scope does altering the focus of BRI present for trade and commerce in the entire Indo-Pacific region, not merely for a specific nation, but for the region as a whole? So
okay, I got. So at first, thanks for Professor Mukherjee. I understood what should I mention about the last question. So I would like to start at that point, and making a balance of protection or private information and empowerment of information is very difficult as RCEP problem. So we hope if it is possible, it is better for us to share all of information, and we agree all of these kind of agreements. And like that, for example, if we can share all of our healthcare information to all over the world, we might be able to save many lives. So it's very valuable things that, as we discussed about that, it is so difficult from the perspective of security reason. So I understood that as Mr. Akshay actually mentioned, if we can make the platform for dealing with the information as a product, it might be helpful for our collaboration. And if India and Japan can collaborate for making some platform for disseminating some information, for like identifying the section for sharing the information, will help our data empowerment. And I'll go for answering the RCEP problem. And for RCEP, almost all agendas are discussed by other panelists, and I totally agree with them, with you all. As you mentioned, maybe for India it is difficult to join the RCEP because of the market access problem and gaps of interesting matters. But still, I would like to insist that it is important for us to continue to discussion for how can we collaborate more, and if we can continue to discuss about that, maybe we can get some results from that. So this is my answer. And for the question of BLI, BLI is for Japanese, it is also like kind of animal or like that. So we do not know about the detail of that. So we need to monitor that kind of actions, and hopefully we can make a better relationship with that kind of very huge project. And I will give mic to coordinator. Thank you so much.
Mr. Rohan Samarajiva.
Thank you. The question began with a mention of a post-pandemic world. So I think we can look at both questions, highlighting what a post-pandemic world and what its implications are for the BRI on one side and for trade agreements on the other. I think what a post-pandemic world does is that it makes one, particularly companies and also governments, rethink and think more deeply about supply chains. Think about resilience and things of that nature, because if your supply chains are broken, and you didn't really have stockpiles, you were going to suffer. And we saw that happen in some instances. In some instances, we saw the global supply chain components were working while the domestic supply chain parts broke, and so on. So the BRI is sort of like a Rorschach blot. All kinds of people put all kinds of meaning to it. And perhaps the Chinese want us to keep it in that form. Now, sitting in Sri Lanka, we see it as a logistics, transportation phenomenon. It's all about ports and the maritime Silk Route. And then on the other side, you see the trains that are running from China to Europe and things of that nature. So one of the things that I think will happen with as a result of the pandemic is that in our rethinking of the supply chains, we will be somewhat wary about the really long supply chains. Now, I was looking to see who's the biggest export market for Bangladesh. It's the United States. For Sri Lanka, it's the United States. For Thailand, it's a much smaller percentage, but even for Thailand, it's the United States. So that's a long relationship. I think people will be looking more with the Asian markets developing at supplying Asia, which would mean necessarily the displacement of US and Europe as the primary and most attractive export markets, gradually, of course, not immediately. And also the diversification of where you source. So instead of sourcing only from China, you source from China, but you also source from Vietnam, and you source from Philippines, and so on and so forth. So if that is the case, intra-Asian connectivity will become more important. And in my initial comments, I talked about, I was asked to talk about digital connectivity, but I said digital connectivity by itself doesn't solve any problems. It has to go together with the transportation networks and the ability to move goods. And then it also has to go with the absence or the lowering of institutional barriers. So what the BRI will do for many of our countries is that once you build the road, you can't prevent all kinds of other people from going for short distances, long distances, etc. on it. All roads do not lead to Beijing. They may stop in Bangladesh. They may stop somewhere else, right? So if that happens, I think the BRI investments and the BRI activated infrastructure developments will help us to improve intra-Asian connectivity, physical connectivity, ability to move goods, and to some extent, ability to move services as well, because you need to move people, you need to move bits and bytes, and so on and so forth. Now, I agree with all the market access concerns that were mentioned in regard to RCEP. But in many cases, what a lot of the resistance to trade agreements, and I've been in the middle of too many public trade debates in Sri Lanka, is that it hinders the government's ability to unilaterally change the rules. So it gives things, it gives certainty. Now, a lot of people who are in the deal, who are what we in Sri Lanka call crony capitalists, the people who make money and who make profits because of their political relationships, they would much rather have their government have the flexibility. Once you enter into trade agreements, that flexibility is gone. So I think in terms of small, the question was about small and medium enterprises and their ability to participate in these, in the larger trade economy. I think trade agreements, if they're properly crafted, if they do remove the discretion that a lot of governments exercise, or if they at least reduce it, I think there'll be greater opportunity for the small players to come in. And that's something I really didn't expand on in my original comments, which is that with the trading platforms, and if you can have rules that govern trading platforms across borders, a lot of the hassle, the transaction costs are taken by the platform, and the small and medium producers don't have to go through filling up, multiple 32 copies of customs forms and so on and so forth. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Samarajiva. Akshay, your views on this?
I think I have not dealt with trade and products, but only in services. And I think one of the most important distinction that I wanted to make between products and services, beyond my earlier comment, is that when it comes to services, it impacts domestic regulations. And so a very important part of services negotiations is harmonizing or mutually recognizing regulations across different countries. This is not true for products. The products had certain standards which you had to meet, which were checked at the border, that do they meet certain sanitary standards, etc. But here, in the case of services, say if it's education or healthcare. If there's a trade agreement between India and Singapore, India, Sri Lanka, India, Japan, you have to ensure that the education certificates in India are recognized by those in Japan. In the case of healthcare, you have to ensure that the nursing degrees that you get in India are applicable to are recognized by those in Malaysia, so they can be hired. So, and also in the case of online content, each country has their own rules for intermediaries, and those intermediary rules have to be in sync. What may be offensive in one country and illegal may not be the case somewhere else. So that's why the WTO and other places, there is now a serious discussion on domestic regulations for services. And so I think that it requires a different kind of competence. It requires a different kind of effort. It requires a different government division, because typically Commerce Ministry was able to negotiate on behalf of the country. But in this case, you have to get the regulators in India to actually step forward. You have the telecom regulators, you have the Medical Council of India. We have to build capacity to do those kinds of negotiations and give those inputs. So I think there is a very significant conceptual difference in the negotiations that will have to take place.
Okay, I presume that there are a few more questions that are coming up, but we are almost at the end of the session. So, in fact, it's time to conclude this session by thanking all the panelists who have essentially devoted their time, as also brought about some extremely valuable insights as far as the state of commerce in the Indo-Pacific is concerned. We simply cannot conclude. It's very difficult to conclude because there are so many issues that have been discussed. We talked about the free trade agreements, we talked about the regional trade agreements, we talked about the digital economies. Now the fact remains that there are some of the crucial points that have emerged that indeed, as far as the space is concerned, which actually I also mentioned, that we do not really have a holistic trade architecture or an economic architecture to withstand this entire Indo-Pacific domain. It's a fact that the digital space has invaded in the post-pandemic world and has created greater efficiency in terms of trade negotiations, in terms of trading as a whole, thereby lowering the transaction cost of doing business. It's a fact that as far as RCEP is concerned, it's a very, very important platform. But at the same time, India, of course, has its own reasons as far as coming out of the space is concerned. Now comes the question of BRI, which remains, which of course most of the speakers have agreed that it's almost like an unknown animal to all of us, and how it is going to unfold as far as future is concerned, whether it's really part of China's market imperialistic designs or really the Marshall Plan to revive the global economy, that again remains a debatable issue. But the fact remains that as far as the economic architecture of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, we don't have a common economic architecture. It will be difficult to emerge with a common economic architecture. There will be a host of regional and national goals that are going to invade over those. But at the same time, what the session also brought about are the costs of unbridled trading mechanism. So it is not that we can only think about the monotonicity of trade as a function of human well-being. So there are costs that are going to be involved in the process. We talked about the digital divide. We talked about the fact that even suppose say free trade mechanisms are going to have their impacts on the national level commodity or services value chain. And we have already witnessed that. In fact, when it comes to the edible oil value chain, then in fact we found that a host of imports have been happening from Southeast Asia, as also from Latin America, especially in palm and soya. I mean that led to the closures of quite a few processing units in India, and that is precisely why, in fact, the Solvent Extractors Association moved to the Ministry of Commerce to raise the tariffs as far as edible oil imports are concerned. In the same way, I presume that somebody brought about in the session the issue of electronics and the electronic markets, how they have invaded this entire space, and much to the adding to the woes of the domestic industry. So this of course, trade becomes a two-level game. In fact, on the one hand, you need to think about the consumers, because end of the day, it's the consumers who turn out to be the beneficiaries of trade, because you get access to cheaper imports. On the other hand, you have to reconcile with the needs of the domestic producers and the domestic industry in the process, because they are also the ones. So are we really competitive enough? That remains the question, if we at all open up. And this is true for not only India, but most of the Asian economies that we are talking of, and especially South Asia. If at all, because this question came up, can we really integrate into the ASEAN value chain if at all we get into the RCEP? Had we gone into the RCEP? Probably the factors against it, or the reasons against it, are also too many. As far as the Indian SMEs are concerned, they are not really competitive enough as compared to the other nations involved. At the same time, the transaction cost of doing business in India is pretty high. Or as far as the taxation regime is concerned, in fact, we are still inefficient. We are the only nation in the RCEP, rather the only nation in the world, which still has a transaction cost for hedging or risk management. We have a commodity transaction tax. We have a securities transaction tax. So that when you have such a phenomenon, such an architecture still existing, and still not thinking of reducing the transaction cost of doing business, as also in fact protecting domestic industry so as to not being competitive enough to essentially compete in the global domain, it becomes a critical question on whether we would have benefited sufficiently in getting into a regional trade agreement. Of course, this needs a broader, quantitative, and of course, a much more holistic, integrated analysis before we conclude further. So thanks to all the panelists for raising a host of many critical issues. Of course, the reporters have taken notes of all the issues that you have raised on various spheres. Thanks yet again. Thanks to the technical team for carrying this out so smoothly. Thanks all. Thank you.